Welcome to this real-world evidence for decisions webinar. Just waiting a few seconds until everyone is connected. I see we have a raising number of participants, so welcome everyone. If we can bring the slides up. Super. Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Today we will be discussing endpoints from digital technologies and their potential to provide meaningful outcomes for healthcare decision makers, including HTA bodies, health technology assessment bodies, and payer bodies. My name is Alina Pavel, and I am part of the Secretariat of the Real World Evidence for Decisions, which is provided by the European Public Affairs Organization, FIPRA. And I am delighted to be joined today by Eric Sutherland as co-moderator. Next slide, please. Eric is a senior economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, where he is leading on digital health topics. Let's begin with some housekeeping. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours with a mix of presentations and panel discussions. There will be plenty of time for you to provide input via the Q&A function in Zoom, and the webinar recording will be available on the Real World Evidence for Decisions website. If you want to ask questions, please rename yourself to show your name and affiliations. We will also share a written report later on. Moving on to the next, let's just speak a bit about real-world evidence for decisions. It is a HTA payer-led multi-stakeholder learning network focusing on the challenges posed by highly innovative medicines. Many of these medicines show great promise in areas of high unmet need, but are often presented to HTA and payer bodies with immature clinical evidence and high prices that often lead to important uncertainties when pricing, reimbursement, and access decisions have to be made. The aim of real-world evidence for decisions is to discuss whether real-world evidence can be used to resolve some of these uncertainties or fill those evidence gaps. This requires consideration of the potential to generate robust real-world evidence over the life cycle, asking questions like, how do we get good quality real-world data? How will HTA bodies assess real-world evidence? And how do we build trust in real-world evidence? Also, we're thinking, can we co-create processes that generate robust real-world evidence post-launch? We discuss these issues in invitation-only roundtables, public webinars like this one, and we create public outputs. These multi-stakeholder discussions began several years ago, led by the Belgian payer INAMI, and became formalized into the Real-World Evidence for Decisions Learning Network in 2019. Real-world evidence for decisions is now led by a wide range of stakeholders who freely offer their time to direct our work program and get involved practically in the work. You can see individuals from HTA bodies and payers, insurers, clinicians, patients, academia, analytics experts from Europe and North America. My co-moderator Eric Sutherland is here with us, also in his role as a member of the steering group. Experts from the trade associations UCOP and a range of pharmaceutical companies are involved and are funding the secretariat, which is provided by FIPRA. So today, the webinar today, during this, we will be considering if the growth in digital health technologies used in our healthcare systems and used by patients could provide real-world data that can be developed into reliable endpoints to help HTA payers understand the benefit of highly innovative technologies. This might be when used by health technology developers in their clinical studies and then submitted to HTA bodies, or in post-launch evidence generation requested by payers. We will begin the webinar with 2 presentations, each for 10 to 12 minutes, followed by 2 discussants take on the topic, and then a panel discussion with our 4 amazing speakers, which I will be introducing. Then we will be taking questions from the audience, so please do type in your questions in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker, Rosella Dividino. Rosella is responsible for the Innovative Medicines Unit at the Health Technology Innovation Directorate of the Gemelli Teaching Hospital. She is the head of the Health Technology Assessment and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at the Graduate School of Health Economics and Management in Rome. Rosella, you have the stage.
Thank you very much. I share my slide if it's possible. So, okay, perfect. I hope you can see them.
Yes, we can see them now.
Perfect.
Full screen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I just want to add that I am a background in economics and I'm working on health technology assessment now for almost 20 years. I want to, my presentation is focused on the hospital perspective. And just to spoiler you already something, my aim is to demonstrate how hospitals are not only adopters of digital health, but they take off also other roles that are, first of all, those of collectors and developers. Hospitals are collectors of real-world data, as all of us know, but they are collector also needs to which technologies and digital health ones can and should provide an appropriate response. But hospitals, at the moment, mainly big hospitals, play a role also in terms of development or co-development of digital health solutions. Let's start from the first step. Hospitals collect need. On the basis of this need, they are able to define the best possible personalized care at the best moment for the best patients. That in a world where we have digital solutions allow to develop telemedicine or mobile health application able to guarantee the early discharge of patients undergoing surgery. But digital health means also that hospitals are able to monitor a chronic patient at home. But the real goal in many cases is to create the so-called virtual worlds, where not only patients are monitored out of hospital, but their whole clinical pathway is managed in a remote mode. In this way, hospitals know what is needed and can ask what they need to the developers. But in many cases, the digital health strategy of a hospital is even more complete. The hospital don't only to ask what they need, but want to contribute to the development of what they ask. Here you can see a very brief summary of how the Gemelli Teaching Hospital is investing in digital health. In the Gemelli Teaching Hospital, we have Gemelli Generator, we have a spin-off called Gemelli Digital Medicine and Health, and then we have many experience of development of digital solutions. Gemelli Generator was created some years ago with the goal to exploit the hospital real-world data in order to create artificial intelligence algorithm able to guide the clinical practice. While the Gemelli Digital Medicine and Health, as I said, is a spin-off that aims to produce these all kinds of digital solutions, not only those based on artificial intelligence. In this slide, you can see also a case study of co-development, the Azimuth, that was finalized to the definition of a personalized remote care for patients with heart failure. It was a co-development experience because the hospital worked in close collaboration with the industry and with a technological developer. That's because the hospital is aware that he knows what is needed by clinicians and by patients. But the hospital has not the expertise or not yet the expertise to produce this solution and to make them as more usable as possible by patients. But hospitals are adopters, collectors, and developers, but could be or must be, I would say, also assessor of digital health solutions. From an health technology assessment point of view, to assess digital health technology, and not only we have to adapt the assessment to the technology readiness level, we have to, or it's better to assess digital health solution already during a piloting phase, but we should have also appropriate HTA framework. So for digital health, we should have digital framework specific for telemedicine, mobile health, AI. Here are reported two European projects. One is AI Mind, which has defined a framework for artificial intelligence-based technologies, while EDITA represents the future. You can consider EDITA as the unit of the future because it's focused on digital health and wants to provide a flexible enough framework to be adaptable to all kinds of digital health solutions. But to conduct an assessment, what we really need is evidence, both in terms of clinical trials and real-world data. And this must be evidence of good quality. So what about digital endpoint from the perspective of hospital-based health technology assessment? I want to provoke some discussions because are digital endpoints already perceived by hospital as a source of evidence? Are hospitals incorporate these new kinds of endpoints in their assessment? And if yes, why? And if not, why not? Have we a problem of acceptance? And which criteria should the digital endpoint satisfy to be included in the PICO at hospital level, so to be considered already in the scoping phase of the assessment? At the school, I suggest to start from the definitions. Here I reported the definition of outcome and endpoint provided by the UNETA Joint Action and by the Adopter project, that it was a European project focused on HTA at hospital level. UNETA clearly states that outcome is a measure to estimate the treatment effectiveness, and Adopter clearly states that with the word effectiveness, we don't refer only to the clinical one, but we must consider also the organizational and economical impact. That's the reason why in the Adopter handbook, as outcome and endpoint are reported also the length of stay, the number of remission, and so on. And UNETA seems to open the door to digital endpoint, given that it reported that outcomes are distinct from the way in which they are measured. Sorry. 2 weeks ago, it was published its guidelines on outcomes from joint clinical assessment. It was released by the coordination group of the European HTA regulation. This guidance reported explicitly what it was intended with the word digital endpoints. They are classified as patient-generated outcome, even in the case in which they allow to collect endpoint relevant from the clinicians. These guidelines, and that is really important, stress the point that these outcomes must be well validated. So it must be proved their validity and reliability. And then they classify, the guidance classify them as a sort of source of big data, but they do not constitute a particular source of information per se. They must be analyzed and validated. But which is the role of digital endpoint now on HTA at hospital level? We have to investigate which is the perception of digital endpoint, because the perception influences the HTA practice and influence the level of impact that the endpoint can have on the decision-making processes. At least from my perspective and experience, digital endpoints are usually still perceived not as primary outcome, but still as a sort of intermediate or surrogate outcomes. How can they move their role as to reach the level of primary endpoint? We have to demonstrate that they can impact on the most important domain for hospital-based HTA. In this slide, I report you a table taken from the adopter endpoint where in pink are visible the 5 most important HTA domains. And they are the health problem, the safety, the clinical outcome, effect size, quality of evidence, and the economical impact. We have to demonstrate how much the digital endpoints are closely related not only to the clinical effects, but also on the economical impact, and can guarantee a good quality of evidence. That's because the relevance of an endpoint is strictly connected to the kind of research or policy question to which the HTA doers have to provide a response. Then, final provocations. Here report a piece of the PICOS Comtech. The PICOS Comtech is an enriched PICOS, recently released by the Special Intergroup on Digital Health of the eSports Society. In the comparator domain, they include the alternative digital health intervention. My provocation is, are we more open to consider as relevant digital endpoint when we compare one digital solution with another digital solution? Are we less open to consider digital endpoint and as a primary endpoints when we are going to compare a digital solution with a traditional technologies? My response will be yes at the moment to both the questions. I don't know which can be yours. In conclusion, hospitals need digital health. They are acquiring experience in developing or co-developing digital health solutions. They are fully aware of the limitations of traditional endpoints. They contribute to the definition of digital endpoints, but are not fully aware of the full potentiality of this new source of evidence. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rosella, for these interesting insights and reflections about hospital-based health technology assessment. So interesting to understand the value and the various roles of hospitals as developers and assessors as well of digital health technologies. Now, before we move into the discussion, we have one more keynote presentation, and I am delighted that Andreas Hager has joined our webinar today in his capacity as board member of the umbrella patient organization Cystic Fibrosis Europe, which represents the voice of people with cystic fibrosis in Europe. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share. Yeah, now. Perfect. So have you thought about your lives as a Venn diagram? I did 22 years ago when I was in this situation. My first daughter was born with cystic fibrosis, and then at the same time I was a lawyer working with digital health. I was an organizational developer working in the intersection between academia and healthcare, and I was also an entrepreneur. So over the years from year 2000, I worked with a lot of different health systems around the world to figure out how health systems can evolve, and especially how they can be more knowledge-driven and specifically driven, also empowered by the knowledge from the patients and the insights of the patients. So here is the CF Center in Stockholm working together with the patient organization to improve. Here is a visit between US Cystic Fibrosis Foundation representatives and Swedish care, and this is my son, who was born in 2016, who also has cystic fibrosis. So I spent the last 20 years in doing work really close to the floor of healthcare, but I've also been engaged with HTA bodies and various regulatory places in this ecosystem. I was very triggered right from the start when my daughter not only had cystic fibrosis, but she had asthma too. And they gave us this PEF meter, this kind of plastic tube here. And they said, put some marks on this paper and we can maybe figure out what is her asthma and what is her cystic fibrosis. And that got me kind of in contact with the concept of these different measures that seem to really matter to different stakeholders. And I got to know things like FEV1, which is the lung function in a lung volume in 1 second, or BMI, and so how these things seem to can empower discussions between different stakeholders, not the least our discussions with our clinical team. And then I was struck. You can't read this; it's in Swedish, but it's a picture from a box of Ventolin that for inhalation, and this was really a trigger for me to go on an entrepreneurial venture, because here it says that if your daughter has PEF between 120 and 130, you can use this drug, because it means that she probably has more asthma and she needs some other form of inhaling this drug to really help her. So I was struck about how the connection between data that we were collecting that could actually create and change the care plan for my daughter. Then I was, as an entrepreneur, I went out and worked on this platform to help connect the worlds between patients and families and healthcare and research. And that was very much fueled by my daughter, who said, she was 9 years at the time. A few years later, she said, I would like to help others understand us better. Sometimes you don't listen and don't see what we want to teach you. I want you to go home and know how it is to be a patient. I just want to live my life. And that was really also a powerful trigger for me to go on entrepreneurial venture. Then, as life happens, since I was in this place where healthcare met research, a Swedish rheumatologist, Staffan Lindblad, who had been developing this outcomes registry system since the 90s, came to me in 2005 because they were digitizing all the services for follow-up of all the rheumatology patients in Sweden. And he had this vision, and he was already working this way, that we can collect individual patient data, patient around all the interventions, and follow up nationally agreed outcome measures. And we can use this for the individual needs in the patient visits, and we can use it for improvement in groups. And this was strategically super important for rheumatology in Sweden. They were the best in the world to adopt new biologic drugs, and they were best in the world to understand the effects of these drugs, and they implemented systems to collect data on the DAS28, for example, disease activity score, from patients very early, and we digitized these services in 2005. So that was a real learning experience. And then he said to me, or the other thing that I helped a lot with as a lawyer was they were not only using this data for the patient-clinician conversations, but they were also using it for population perspectives. They were collaborating with industry to help them understand their products better, and they were working with the HTA bodies to understand the health economic value of the drug. So this was a real big learning for me in over 6 years, and this has been exported to many countries, and it's the leading, the HTA bodies in Sweden use the rheumatology model as the best-in-class example of how to use real data for HTA. Staffan said, because cystic fibrosis is another deal, and what I saw that what they had in rheumatology that we didn't have in cystic fibrosis were these disease-modifying treatments. So cystic fibrosis was still extremely complex disease, and it was not easy. There was no real disease activity score that we could work on to really push things across. So I felt that, I mean, this is a big challenge if we're going to do it in cystic fibrosis. But he encouraged me to really say that I think that you could do something in cystic fibrosis. And if one day we get a disease-modifying treatment, like you see here, the shift from the full line to the dotted line, then the whole disease will change, and you will need to change all the disease activity measurements, outcomes, and endpoints. So I think you're in a position to really be part of a paradigm shift, he said very early, and that they came 10 years later. The other people that were really influential was, I went to the Dartmouth Institute to train as an improvement coach, and we really, I understood that there was a big power in patient-reported outcome measures, and that we could come together as patients and providers and payers and researchers to really help systems evolve in new ways, but that we speak different languages. Patients speak different languages, researchers speak different languages, pharma companies and providers speak different languages, and we all need to be at the table. So 10 years later, as I mentioned, we had the first disease-modifying treatment coming. It was a protein modulator. And by then I had created a Swedish coalition and a platform. So we were ready to take on the big challenge. Can we now start collecting data to really understand? The thing with Orkambi, it wasn't a very good drug. It was in 100 patients, there were 20 that responded super well. There were 20 that didn't respond at all. And there were a lot of people in the middle that responded so-so. So the health economy didn't come together. The Swedish authorities didn't really want to pay for this expensive drugs. So they came up with these treatment goals. If you as healthcare can show that you have improvement in some of these parameters, then you can continue with the drug, and you can try it for 2 years, and if it works, you can continue. So that was the idea. So then, of course, we looked, okay, when with this in place, what could be reported from patients and how could that be reported? And what do we have already that can report into HTA processes? Then you get into all the complexity, everything around data coverage, data quality issues, really, really tricky issues, right? And then you get into even deeper questions around quality of life and as the whole disease is shifting, how do you manage that? We don't have it in the system. We don't know how to do it. How should this work? So in the end, there is a negotiation, and what we came up with that we all agreed on is that if the patient can collect data around antibiotics use, that can really help move towards a new definition of exacerbations, because the old definition of exacerbations in cystic fibrosis included bloody sputum samples and being an inpatient. And patients, at least in Sweden, are never inpatients anymore, at least not the young ones, and the blood in the sputum is not as frequent. So we knew that we need to develop new endpoints. And we also knew that the registries around the world, this is a paper from the US CF registry, only has information about the intravenous antibiotics. So we knew that this was an interesting endpoint for everyone. It wasn't even a discovery or endpoint in the studies, but we knew that we need to learn more about the oral antibiotics and the inhaled antibiotics. So we worked on that, and we also developed a conceptual model to capture data so it could be used in the private sphere, in healthcare, and for research. So we also worked very closely to kind of see how can we create data flows that can also help the different stakeholders. And we defined these 3 action arenas that we really need to carefully protect to have digital health and digital collection of data. And it's published in a model that you can all read, and you will get these slides after. But there's a lot of details and stuff in this that you can explore. So my goal in life is to work with a personal health information exchange that can empower people living with long-term illness, and that can support us working together in improving care, and generate data that can be used for all these different purposes. So that's what I work with, and try to collect examples from myself and others. And this is kind of inch wide, mile deep stuff. So I hope I haven't, hope you have some questions and are not too confused. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, so much for sharing with us this personal story, really, and how your family's journey inspired this paradigm shift in how stakeholders and decision makers understand patients and the data they collect and input in these processes. I would just like to remind, as Andreas highlighted, that the audience can also submit questions for the speakers in the Q&A box, when you can also upvote other people's questions. And before I hand over to Eric to co-moderate the discussion, I would just like to say a few words about our 2 inspiring panelists, discussants. So we have Anja Schiel with us, Senior Advisor and Methodologist in the Regulatory and Pharmacoeconomic Statistics unit at the Norwegian Medicinal Products Agency, where she works on both regulatory and health technology assessment projects. Joining us today is also Lara Wolfson, who is an Associate Vice President and Head of Health Technology Assessment at MSD. She also co-leads the European Special Interest Group of the European Federation of Statisticians in the Pharmaceutical Industry. Eric, I hand over the moderation to you now.
Thank you, Elena. This has been by far the most easy job of co-moderation, because frankly, I haven't done anything yet. And very significant thank yous to both Rosella as well as to Andreas, for your presentations, and obviously some heartfelt perspectives, especially for Andreas in terms of some of the challenges associated with these patient journeys. Is one of the reasons why when I journeyed over to health many years ago, it was important for me to actually understand and live some of these patient journeys much more so, and try to work out how we can use our data and our digital tools and technology in order to improve lives for people everywhere. So hearing about some of the work you've done and some of the perspectives you're bringing, I think are fantastic. My personal perspective in terms of where we're meant to go with digital technologies is we want to live in a world where 8 billion people are empowered with their health data, guided by health professionals, informed by algorithms and tools like artificial intelligence. And if we can actually get there, that would be pretty cool. But as part of that is recognizing that there are opportunities for greater interaction between patients and individuals and their own personal health experience and the health system in and of itself to actually inform things like HTA analysis. There's also challenges with that in terms of the veracity and the timeliness of some of the information. And so really trying to unpack this in terms of understanding how some of these digital endpoints fit in is going to be really, really amazing. I'll simply, before I ask the first question of Laura, I will let people know that I already answered one of the questions live, which was, are the presentations going to be available after the fact? They are. So I've just said it verbally as well. And please do keep the questions coming in the chat. But with this, I will turn over my first question, or ask my first question rather, to you, Laura. So from your perspective and where you sit, I'm curious on what do you think is the potential of these new and emerging technologies, especially the personal technologies, and how are the technology developers using them to demonstrate their value in these highly innovative medicines going forward? But you're on mute. Somebody had to be the first one to do it.
Hey, I'm always the volunteer for the technology challenge. Thanks. So I think that's a really interesting question, because I think on the one hand, there's a huge amount of interest in the potential of digital technologies. I think where there's sometimes concern is, how do we validate them? So I think one of the biggest challenges in HTA is that when we go to, when as industry, when we take a dossier to either a regulator or to an HTA agency, I think everyone wants to know, we're sure that this endpoint measures what we all think it measures. And so one of the questions is, how do you get there? But on the other hand, in industry, and I think in general in the scientific community, one of the things that we have with clinical trials is that we're all sort of sharing a common goal, that we have innovative treatments. We want to get we want to figure out, are these treatments safe and effective? And if they are, we want to get them to patients as fast as possible. And we want to minimize the burden on patients to get there. So digital technologies have this huge potential to minimize patient burden. And so if you think about all of the data collection that we have to do and how much of a burden it places on a patient who's already suffering, right? We don't want to add increases to that. And so where digital technologies can help us get data that helps us evaluate safety and efficacy of a product in a way that is less burdensome to patients and more accurate, that's a win for everybody, patients and industry and scientists and eventually payers and healthcare providers. And the ability to even think about the fact that one of the concerns that everyone has with clinical trials is that clinical trials are done under specialized conditions, right? And so adherence is often better in a clinical trial than in the real world. Digital technologies open the door potentially that, if some of those digital technologies are something that you can wear long term, and I think there's been huge advances in some of these things, like in the diabetes field with type 1 diabetics who can wear digital monitors that let them know when their sugar levels are dropping too low. These are the kind of things that say, hey, the real world experience with the drug can be the same as what it is in a clinical trial with heavy monitoring. I think the concern, though, is how do we prove that a digital technology actually measures what we need it to measure, and that it provides validity to everyone, patients, payers, providers, industry. And then the question is, sometimes I think we're trying to run faster than we can walk. You know, when we talk about the AI and the explosiveness and the development of all of these things, they're growing and getting out there faster than we can test them. And so if we try to take digital technologies and think of testing and evaluating them the same way we test and evaluate drugs, the barriers could be really high to validation. And so one of the questions is, how do we find that balance between, we want to rigorously know that these tools are valid and do what everyone thinks they're doing, but we don't want to create a process that's so burdensome and onerous and long to test them that they're technologically out of date by the time we've done all of that validation. And I don't have an easy answer to this. I can just say that I think this is the problem we're facing as a community, is where to find that balance.
Wow. So I'm going to use the line, we are running faster than we can walk, because it is so true. Like my general perspective, and I'm very prepared to be challenged on this, but we are going to live in a world where there are more digital tools and technologies, AI-powered algorithms, than drugs. And at which point, exactly the point that you were just raising, how do we actually scale? Like, do we even scale up our existing HTA practices, or what version of validation is necessary? And then I'll throw on additional wrench into that balance of rigor and time, because I totally agree with you. Spending 2 years to validate something means that you're like 15 versions late. But then the challenge is, after it's invalidated, because it's software, the software can be updated. Does it need to undergo a full revalidation cycle in and of itself? These are questions that keep me up at night. And like you, do not have an answer. But it's clearly areas where I think that significant effort needs to be played as we are, or paid attention to as we're moving forward. So thank you for all of that. And with that, I will, however, pass, or rather ask Anya a question. So as a fellow statistician, by the way, fellow statistician, I'm not an economist, as much as it says so on my business card. I'm actually a statistician who works in both regulation and with health technology assessments. What are your perspectives? What are the challenges that you're seeing? And we'll get to, and what should we do about it?
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Laura, for the good reflections and the good presentations before. And let me start. As a statistician, you know, we often are seen as the ones that are so super critical. And I would say maybe we are perceived the wrong way, because for me, data is data. There's good data, there's less good data, or bad data, however you want to call it. And digital endpoints are just another type of data. So we shouldn't be too afraid. What kind of sets people off is the magnitude of the, you know, the size of the data we can generate nowadays that we weren't used to in the past. But that in itself is not a problem. What I think is a problem is that we need to understand the context of use and the impact this has. So when I take my regulatory hat as a statistician, then I tend to think of digital tools mostly as a refinement of something we already have. So we have a really crap version of it that we've been using for many years, and now we might find really good ways on improving the quality of the measure itself. But whatever we measure should be the same. Replacing is a lot more complex, and Laura knows exactly what I'm talking about. Replacing a established endpoint is a different story. Yet I must say that just because new stuff is coming, we cannot reinvent the wheel every time, which means that we don't need a guideline for everything all the time. Sometimes we just have to say the good old rules that we had for other outcomes still apply for your outcome, irrespective of that it is, you know, larger in magnitude, for example. And for that, we don't necessarily need statisticians. I think we need data engineers and people that have a different expertise. So don't always expect that the statisticians are magicians. We are normal people. We can't do all of it, but we can give you a framework that will help you to avoid mistakes. But there is this regulatory refinement, but then there is another step. That's the one between the benefit risk and the cost effectiveness for many HTAs. Because if a digital tool has an impact on the actual benefit risk, it would also automatically have a direct impact on the cost effectiveness, meaning you're moving from this experimental safe harbor of the clinical study into the real world, where suddenly patients, not the participants in the trial, are supposed to experience their real world effectiveness. And they probably need some digital tool to actually achieve it. So if I optimize adherence, then this optimization is not just one-to-one translatable from the trial to any healthcare system, meaning that there you have a gray area about responsibilities and how it is perceived. And then the last version is obviously the fun stuff, the nice to have, but not really needed or not really linked to any intervention, which is probably kind of challenging for HTAs if you want to get reimbursement for something that is in a way not even linked to any treatment. That is probably very challenging as a concept for HTAs and healthcare systems, but it is something that is, you can overcome this obstacle. You just have to learn how to send in a submission actually that's not pharma and not just the device, but it really explains the benefit to the healthcare system. And as said, I mean, you can't expect always that we make new rules for everyone and everything. So also the digital endpoints have to stick to some basic rules of validation. You know, how do we actually refine? How do we make them attractive to those that are supposed to use it in the end? But the gray area is probably the most problematic one, because there is this same problem as for any other outcome. If you move something from a trial to a healthcare system context, then it is very context dependent. So whatever works in country A does not automatically have to work in country B to the same extent, or might be perceived having the same value. And that is, I think, the big hurdle for everyone and everything in the transition from regulatory to HTA, this kind of understanding that something that works perfectly in the Western world is not going to work perfectly in Africa if people don't even have a mobile phone. And that is kind of an underlying principle.
And yet, there are opportunities for some of the, especially the sub-Saharan African innovations to, as I like to think, leapfrog and avoid the mistakes that we have made in a lot of the westernized things. In the same way that China, when they were going through their technological revolution, they skipped landlines and went straight to cell phones. And so I think from an Africa perspective, for example, what is their version of skipping cell phones and going to whatever? And to what extent can we actually wire up the country? Because as we are increasingly seeing, digital, as has been said, is a determinant of health. And so if it is a determinant of health, how do we actually make sure people have the appropriate access? But that is a vast segue from where we were. So with that, I'll invite all the panelists to come on screen if we can. And I actually wanted to start with one of the questions from the Q&A for Andras, where you were asked, from your experiences, what are the keys to a successful initiative? Who are the most important stakeholders to work with, or do you need them all together around the table?
Thank you. Well, of course, I don't have a perfect answer, but one thing that Staffan taught me in the beginning, and he'd been working 10 years, and we've been working on it since, is something he called the mirror principle. And the mirror principle idea is that when you do something or give something, there should be a mirror that gives you something back that you want. So this issue of feedback loops and understanding what is meaningful and interesting for the person that is asked to do something in the system is key. And so the obvious stakeholders is the patient and the provider engaged, and patient, at least in Sweden, is defined as a person that has a relationship with healthcare. So the relationship there is kind of key, and the informatics in that dyad. Then you have a person in that inner circle, which is the researcher that has the right to be there, and has the researcher perspectives on. So I think those three stakeholders are the key, and the researcher can be the guide to understand authorities and companies and regulators and everyone else, and what they would be looking for in a mirror later on. So I would start there, and then I would also add that the hospital that Rosella is talking about is a very tricky place, under extreme pressure, no redundancy, people don't have time. So depending on, but they are super, super important because they are responsible for patient safety. They are responsible for information safety. So if you're not having them in the system, then you're standing on very thin ice in the long run. So that's a kind of a wicked, the wicked space, the patient and the provider, the informatics. So how can you arrange a mirror principle for them? And then the last thing I'm going to say here is to distinguish infrastructure from information, because the app is an app, it's an infrastructure, or the database is a database, and the pipe is a pipe. But the information itself, and the feedback loops and the requirements on the information, that's the thing to keep the eye on. And if you do that, then you are on to interoperability, and you're on to a lot of different issues that will be important in the long run.
Thank you, Andres. I think it's fascinating to reflect that having someone at the table as a researcher to help the translation of the languages between the public and the providers and the private sector and the innovators. My background being of an English origin, I reflect on, there's a book called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they have the Babel fish, which allows people to translate languages back and forth. And so we need that type of translator between all the various people, and making sure all those perspectives at the table, as well as people to actually translate between them. I think it's brilliant. Very much appreciate it. And actually, ironically, the analogy that I tend to use around digital health is that the pipes represent the technologies, the taps represent the analytics and the AI systems, but it's the water that flows between them that is absolutely essential. That's the data and information. And yet we tend to focus our energy on building pipes and building taps, and we forget about curating the water. But it's actually the water that actually provides life. So how can we make sure that we're actually spending more time on that? I really appreciate that perspective. So I'm going to go, another question from the chat, I'm going to go to you, Anya. So from your perspective, would using a patient as its own control address some of the contextual difference when measuring real world outcomes?
I mean, the question is a bit broader than just digital, I would say. And yes, I mean, in essence, in the most beautiful of all worlds, we would all be linked to some kind of detection device that measures all kind of things all lifelong. And we could actually easily see that something has changed. You know, be it your degree of activity, be it your blood pressure, be it something else. And these changes from baseline for the individual is obviously probably the most important indicator. But would it work in a clinical trial? Depends on the setting. I guess yes, we could come up with such situations, and we have trial designs where we have been using the patient baseline as some kind of control or a run-in period. But the digital outcomes is really, it's very, very context dependent. And as I said, it depends on what you really want to achieve. In a clinical trial, experimental setting, yes, I think it's no problem. In the real world, we don't have this device that, you know, has been measuring my last 20 years and can tell me how my blood pressure changed over time. So retrospect, it's very difficult. Unless it's something very short term, then I don't think it's the solution per se, but there are definitely occasions where I would say that this is a possibility to at least define a better baseline before you do an intervention.
Very, very cool. I love that. One of the things we do not do enough from a digital perspective is even let alone in medical care, defining baselines. We don't actually define baselines to actually measure the effectiveness of our health technologies. So when we actually implement the technologies, we often say, hey, look, we just achieved X. It's like, yeah, but what's the change from before? Oh, well, which is another challenge that we have. I'm going to go to another question from the chat. So I'll put this to Rosella, but I'm curious if others are interested in perspectives in this as well, where lots of companies are developing apps, and thereby those apps are often duplicative. Like every hospital has their own diabetes app or asthma app, as the case may be. How can we actually encourage to reduce the duplication and ensure that multi-stakeholder development of the apps actually work together, such like the one that Andreas was talking about before for antibiotics?
Yes, we have many duplicated apps, but we have, first of all, to understand if they're really duplicates, and we have to analyze them to understand which is the best for our needs. That's the reason why in my hospital, we decided to take the role of co-developer or anyway to define our own digital strategy, because we want to avoid to have 1,000 apps in the same hospital. We have to centralize their governance, and we want to guarantee a good level of quality of them. No app is equal to the other, as no drug is equal to the other, even if they are in the same HTA class. And to reduce duplication, we need to define a strategy, a governance to decide who certificate an application. Now, at least in Italy, we don't have a central body that is responsible for that. Usually, digital solution enter through the hospital and then arrive to the whole healthcare system. And that's the problem for hospital. They don't have to say yes to everything. They have to assess it, to dedicate the resources to the assessment. And then I read another comment that was very interesting about the duplication of apps, the endpoints, out-of-dating issues. We have to ask us not only how many apps we have, but also how we use them and for how long. We have issues of adherence to apps to be different in terms of usability. We are all used to have many applications on our mobile, but we usually forgot them after less than a month to use. So that's another aspect to consider when we compare applications.
Wow, thank you. Laura, I see that you would like to pile on or rather add to the conversation.
So I think this question of Rosella and Andreas both raised some really interesting points about these apps that get developed are sometimes different and they cover slightly different things. And so you don't want to lose those differences. But at the same time, if you go back to what Andreas talked about, the mirroring issue, that trying to look at the needs of all the stakeholders. And so to me, one of the interesting things here is that on the industry side of things, typically what happens is industry goes in and develops an app because they can see a gap. They see that there's some barrier to getting access to the medication or adherence to the medication. And I think one of the great examples of this is in the field of diabetes, with all of the ability that people have now to measure their HbA1c, to measure their blood sugars on a regular basis. For type 1 diabetics, they have insulin pump monitors. Really great advances in those digital technologies, but each of them was developed typically in relationship to a particular drug and with the needs of those drugs. But then you turn around and you say, at some point, you say, hey, these are really useful. They are improving patient adherence. They're good for patients. They're good for hospitals. They're good for healthcare providers. They're good for, they're good for everyone. But there are so many of them. How do you pick between them? How do you know which one is right? And part of it goes back to this idea of mirroring it back and taking it back to groups like Real World Evidence for Decisions, or like Cystic Fibrosis Europe as a patient organization, which is to say that people are developing things to answer the question that they have, right? And not necessarily looking at the universal questions that need to be answered. So how do we get to that question, which is, what are the questions that people want answered that an app might help do? And could we set standards for it? And so one of the things that WHO often does, for example, is to set a target product profile for a new vaccine, and to say that, hey, we would introduce a malaria vaccine. We would find it acceptable if it met the following criteria. We can take that same principle into the digital world and say, hey, based on talking to hospitals, based on talking to patients, based on talking to people who provide lab care services, these are the criteria that would make a really useful app, that would make really useful data that could provide meaningful output. And then you would end up with things that the duplication that happened would be sort of natural competition, which is who can get to the finish line to meet those target product profile requirements first. Or you might find that people said, hey, let's work together because you know how to do parts A and C, and I know how to do parts B and D. But somehow what's happening is that this is a new space. I think it's great to see all the innovation that people are jumping into to try to do different things. But now we need to find ways to harness and direct it. And so part of that's going to be finding ways to take that step back and bring stakeholder groups together to talk about what are those target product profile for digital health technologies.
Really fascinating. We need to at least have a common objective, if not a common foundation that we're working from. Love it. Andreas.
Thank you. So right now I'm here at the Karolinska University Hospital helping a bit, and they have the challenge within Diabetes 1 now that they have eight different data sources when it comes to devices and measurement, and they have a multitude of decision support systems. So to start separating these, the apps, the collecting the feedback loops to the users, and the decision support systems is an important trend right now. That and this goes back to the business models of the apps. It's been maybe the only way to get a functional business model for your app, that you had a decision support system for healthcare. But we can't do it that way anymore. We need to separate these and find information exchanges in between, and then we get into all of the informatics challenges, all of these issues of consolidating, understanding the different purposes, and making sure data works well. So that's one thing that I see, that the distinguishing decision support systems from apps, and then, of course, making it super meaningful for the consumer, for the patient to use this system, and also maybe find ways to have people manage their own data. Of course, that's my personal bias. But with Johns Hopkins right now in the US, we're working to disassemble our system and put it back together, having evidence-based behavior change techniques. So I see that as a next paradigm when it comes to regulatory also, that starting to not look at apps as an app, but looking at apps as something that has some different modules or interventions that are the ones that are subject to regulatory approval. So that's also a kind of I see in the horizon here, which is tough for app developers, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Also with the Babelfish in the omnipresent.
Thank you. And actually, that's a nice segue to one of the other questions we had in the Q&A for Anya. So from your perspective, with your regulatory hat on, do you have any specific guidelines or regulations for the health technology assessments of digital devices?
Honestly, I think we're a bit thin when it comes to the HTA side. Professor Di Bidognoni, she actually showed, the section that is in our guideline. It sounds awfully familiar to me. It might actually be from me. And because it hasn't been top of the list of the things that needed to be addressed for the HTA upcoming regulation. So these endpoints are kind of out there, but it's not really as if they were something that HTAs feel they need to regulate immediately. And I think one of the reasons is what we just discussed, on the one hand side, it's a business model. And that's one use case. That use case is really something that's just controlled by demand and supply, I would say. On the other hand, on the regulatory side, we do qualifications, which is usually the way how you get something into the regulatory system. That's a long, very long and painful process, I can guarantee you, because there is this problem that regulators don't want to approve a product per se in this field. They approve a concept, which actually is also Joseph was asking, how do digital endpoints go out of date? Well, it's not the digital endpoint, it's the algorithm that goes out of date. And in times where apps are constantly refined and updated, a qualification of a concept is very difficult because the concept seems to change all the time. And hence, for regulatory approval, it is a long-term process, and that's where Lara is right when we start running before we walk, because we haven't even agreed on how we define collected data and the algorithm that we find acceptable. And then we already 20 versions down the road, and whatever we qualified is no longer what the developer wants to use. So we are having a clash here in speed of running and walking, because everybody in the system is doing this at a very different speed. And we need to really agree on where we want to talk about. So when you come to me and the question is specifically HTA and device, it depends on if your device is meant to apparently increase the effectiveness of a drug, then it is part of an HTA assessment. Then we are faced with a problem that we probably have no technical capability to assess actually the algorithm on the HTA side. What we will assess is the costs that come with it and whether they are really related to some improved effectiveness in the real world. That is what we always do. If it's not directly linked, like a gadget that doesn't need a drug or whatever, but improves your sleep, as I say, that's a bit more difficult. I wouldn't even know how to submit such a request to an HTA, honestly. I would find it difficult. This is more in the world of the HTA of hospitals, for example. I think Professor Di Bidognoni can much better explain how this would be healthcare system relevant. My HTA is more cost utility analysis, so it's about the costs and the trade-offs we have to make for this. And already within HTA, I think we have different fields and different versions of what HTA wants to achieve, which would require different guidances to how we address this issue. And I'm honest about this, we are far, far away from anybody writing any comprehensive guidance on this topic at the moment, because this has been coming on sideline when everybody was occupied with other things, like the HTA. And now it's moving at lightning speed compared to us dinosaurs that are walking usually on the regulatory side in very low speed. And now we're clashing somehow. On the other hand, as a dinosaur, I'm usually a big obstacle in the way, and the little fast-moving objects hit me. They might hurt me, but doesn't mean they really make me move. So it's somewhere there, and I'm really sorry if that isn't an answer that anybody wanted to hear, but it is how it is.
I think it's one of the magic of these webinars. Sometimes you just say, this is where things are at. And then hopefully we can create some momentum that if it's a problem that is like worthy of focus, that this is actually causing harm by not focusing on it, then hopefully the forum itself creates the momentum for some sort of meaningful action. which I'm going to use that as a segue. So I'm going to try and cover two questions at once. And I think I will take this one, and I will start with Laura, although I'll be curious if others would lean in on it. This has to do with the data. And with the data, there's a question about the incentives to improve data coverage and collection, and not just to improve data coverage and collection, but also coherence. Because there's the second question, which talks about that, if every hospital is building their own app, how do we actually aggregate the data together for broader decision making? So how do we create the incentives to both collect the data and aggregate the data in order to use the data for decision-making purposes? Can I start that with you, Laura?
Yeah, so it's actually a really fascinating question, and it takes me back a little in my history. I spent 10 years working for the World Health Organization, and one of the things I worked on was trying to improve national data systems for collecting data on vaccine coverage. And this is really old school, right? Because this was collected pen on paper. But one of the most important things we learned is that data is collected best when it's used, and it's used locally. So if you think about every stage of this system, if the patient finds that data useful, if their healthcare provider finds that data useful, that's the first step. You've got to take that data and say, it's not just about feeding up into the top of the system, that it feeds to the overall hospital, or it feeds into a health technology assessment, or it feeds into a developer. But the number one way that you get good data collected is making sure that the people who have to provide that data find it useful. And so a lot of it goes to thinking about these apps. And, again, the diabetes stuff is one of the best examples of this, right? It provides real-time information to a diabetes patient that says, you need to take corrective action right now, today, in the next 15 minutes. So it's useful to them, and that creates an incentive for them to keep the system up and running on their body and feeding data through the system. Information to their healthcare provider, who's able to say, hey, we need to adjust your dosages. We need to talk about your compliance. And then that data feeds up through the system, right? Hospitals start to find it a useful metric to start to monitor patients, to say, we need people to come in for more regular visits. We can monitor things in real time. And so a lot of it goes to, again, Andreas made this great remark about the idea of mirroring. But if you think about a cystic fibrosis patient, think about their day-to-day life and information that helps them have a better experience as a patient, and helps their healthcare provider provide better care, helps the hospital monitor the performance of the healthcare providers. And then you've got something that feeds up. But then you talk about the fact that, okay, great, that would allow me to create a system within a particular healthcare institution that worked, but that doesn't mean it creates translatable information across a bunch of hospitals in a country, or even across hospitals or healthcare settings in multiple places. And so a lot of this goes to, again, linking it to that decision pathway. How can we understand how this information helps improve things? We have general statements we make about all of this data is used to improve the healthcare journey, but we have to make that tangible and talk about how it will be used centrally, how we can preserve patient privacy and maybe aggregate it at the physician level or aggregate it at the hospital level so that it can feed into a larger system in a comprehensive way. So it takes some work to think through this, but again, going back to the vaccine coverage information, we ended up creating something very simple, which is a monthly chart that says, on average, right? If you just imagine that your birth cohort is distributed across the year, you should be giving out an equal number of doses every month. So if you plot the number of births versus the number of doses given, you're going to find out when you have a problem and go and find out why those kids aren't getting vaccinated. But that's old school. It's not very digital, but the general idea that if you made it tangible for everyone along the value chain of generating the data, how they could use it, that really improved data quality and usability.
To improve data quality, you almost need the positive feedback loop of data being used to actually, oh, this actually helped me in my job, and I see how I'm actually doing things, which causes the data to be used and keep on doing them. People realize, oh, if I put in bad quality data, I won't be able to use the insights, or rather, my friends will not be able to use the insights and it'll actually harm them. So creating that virtuous cycle would actually be great. Actually, Anya, I know you had something you wanted to add as well.
Yeah, I think many people might think that the European GDPR, so the regulation on privacy, is one of the worst things ever for digital tool developers. But I think we should see the opportunity here, because it very much highlighted this problem that people are supposed to give away a lot of information about themselves. And they need to know that it's curated and protected in a proper way. And you see that the European health data space is really bringing us solutions on how to address this problem in a proper way. Because this is one of the most raised concerns, I would say, when people say, yeah, but my data is going to just be out there in the wild, you know, anybody can abuse it. And that has been a problem. And the solution, the GDPR, was maybe a little bit of an overkill, but at the same time, it has made sure that we are not going to, you know, just release all kind of data to everywhere, and that we do understand much better that we need quality in the way we collect data, that we need protection in how we collect data, and that there has to be some criteria. The solutions are there in the European health data space. I think these huge data concepts are sinking in. And we do actually get these data scientists now that we never had, because everybody was asking the statisticians to do something which we just felt like we were not educated for. We have no clue. You're talking to the wrong people. Now we have all these things in place. And I think this is an essential basis for figuring out how to really properly utilize this type of data, because it's not just about empowering. You know, every little app can give a patient the feeling he's empowered, he or she, to understand something better. But then we are back to this: how good is this app really? And I think it's our obligation to make sure that these apps actually really don't just collect wildly data because they can, but rather that they collect relevant data in a safe environment. And then the feedback really in the end has some impact without endangering, you know, the privacy of the user. And in between, maybe it was kind of Wild West, but I think we're getting there and getting it right. So the right level of empowering patients without giving away too much information to too many, you know, people or stakeholders involved that shouldn't have access to it. Because only then I think it can be, as a from a societal perspective, argue that we should advise patients to use something, because this is really very important. For drugs, we are very clear on that. We say there shouldn't be any dangers. I think we should also take this responsibility when it comes to digital tools, to make sure that we only advise patients to use something that really will help them and improve their health, not just because it's fun and someone else would like to have this data.
Yes, everything we do must be with purpose, must be with the person's best interest at heart, not my own interested, geeky curiosity. Anyway, Rosella, I know you have something to add as well.
Yes, I have to want to add something on the topic on centralization of data. It's easy for an hospital like mine, that is one of the biggest in the country, that is a reference center for rare disease, to develop digital solution. Also because in the data management, we have invested a lot in the last 10 years. We paid a lot of attention and energy in creating data lakes of good quality internally to the hospital. I am anyway against a fragmentation, but I think that to centralize in a fragmented world, we should have both top-down and bottom-up initiative. My hospital work on the bottom-up, and we are stressing the top level outside the hospital for asking us all the data that we have. We are open to share the data also because we have to share by law, but nobody is at the moment defining the standards to which they must be aligned for this data. So both the national and local level sure, collaborate, and to centralize, we need to adopt a long-term perspective, because first, the quality of information system must be created and improved. Thanks.
Excellent. I recognize that we're actually nearly at the end of our time. We've actually had a lot of really interesting questions I was not able to get to in the chat. So I'm going to try and combine one of the questions in the chat with the last question I want to ask the panel. Try if I can find the genius of and here, because we talked a lot about endpoints and the value of data and the challenges. So what I'm going to ask each of you is, as we think about all the issues that we talked today, we've talked about technology, the need for partnership, the need for regulation, the accessibility and use of data. We've talked about trust. As we think of all of those various issues, and we think about the evaluation of our systems and of ourselves, given the paucity of evidence that we have, what top priority or what top action, what practical thing do you think we can do as a key next step to make sure that we get the patient-generated data from digital technology sources to provide meaningful and better health technology assessment processes going forward? I'll start with you, Anya.
I think it's really understanding explicitly which of the decisions you want to impact with the use of the digital tool. It's not the same to convince a patient versus convincing some HTA assessor or payer that has to actually pay for the device. And understanding these two aspects, and also that sometimes using a digital tool might not reduce uncertainty for a certain decision, such as the approval or the first reimbursement decision. But I see huge potential for all the downstream tools like managed entry agreements, where the collection of real-world data and real-world evidence is absolutely essential to kind of agree on some outcomes. And we know that real-world data in registries is not really necessarily the best source all the time, because you can very easily define a very agile system to say we want to measure, the ability to walk longer after treatment in the real world is much easier if you do it with some kind of digital tool, and you can easily set that up. And that would be a lot easier than some kind of laborious registry change and collecting new endpoints of patients, blah, blah, blah. I think it would be a lot easier if you just stick a sensor on some of the patients and say, we see where we end up in a year or two.
Laura, follow that.
Well, I think I want to build on that, which is to say that I think as health technology developers, we have to think about, particularly with some of the innovative medicines where we know that the evidence we're going in with from a trial is limited because the patient populations are small sometimes, or we want to get a treatment to patient faster. But can we design digital technologies that we use in the clinical trial that can then be used in the real world setting to help provide ongoing information that helps establish, you're getting a medicine out there, you're getting it to patients, you need to reinforce that it's doing what you thought it would do. And so how can we do a better job of using those kinds of tools in our clinical trials that can then be translated into real world use easily for patients, easily for providers, but helping all of us have long-term data that helps us both evaluate when we're making the initial decisions and continue to evaluate as we're going on. And so I think that's one thing industry really needs to take on board, to look at how we're designing these tools and look at how we're using them and including them as part of the post-launch evidence generation plans.
Marcella.
I fully align with Tanya and Lara. We have to start to using them in the clinical trials in order to continue to use them afterwards, even if I have the doubt with the authority responsible for both treatment and digital device and digital solutions.
And I personally have a bias toward always allowing patients to have the last word. So, Andreas.
Thank you. I will go from the easy, which is tricky, and then I'll go to the real challenging. The first, which is quality of life instruments, have come into big focus, and it's become like the symbol of engaging us and allowing us to tell what really matters to us, and kind of. But the instruments are not designed for that. So that's the new the thing about redesigning quality of life instruments so they can be fit for multiple purposes and real world use. Because we see that it can help us tell our stories, but that's not how they are perceived, and they're not collected for that. So that's one thing, that hands-on thing, and the cystic fibrosis community is trying to develop a new quality of life instrument. The second one, going to the more challenging, is if we can start develop explorative and experimental endpoints together. And why you should be doing this with us is because with these disease-modifying treatments, the natural cause of disease, you have to rethink the natural course, what the disease is, and I think that's the kind of reason for you to engage in that with us. And with some more explorative and experimental endpoints in the studies, you go to the next, which is of societal and global importance, and that's for pharma to start working with HTA 8-10 years upstream to develop how research is done and how clinical development is done, so that clinical development is not only for safety and cost, but also for cost and value. And that's a paradigm shift. And we see it like on the horizon 2 years before something, but we know we need everything needs to move 8-10 years upstream. And pharma needs to stop saying, like Laura said, that our development of our tools, it needs to be kind of our joint development of our tools. And this leads us into the health economic models and transparency and all of that. So I'll end up with that, but that's really at the heart of our challenges.
As my title is a health economist, I do appreciate that very much, Andreas. So with that, I want to thank everyone. I think that was absolutely fantastic and deeply insightful. And with that, I will pass the ball back to you, Elena.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today. It's been a great pleasure to host this webinar and listen to our amazing speakers and to such an engaged audience. And thank you, Eric, so much for the brilliant co-moderation. We talked today about how stakeholders understand each other. And as a final word, I just want to highlight the contribution of real-world evidence for decisions to inter and intra-stakeholder communication and transparency. A key piece of our work this year is a set of stakeholder actions to generate better real-world evidence for HTA and payers' decision-making. And as we are a learning network co-creating outputs with the community, we launched a public consultation on this draft set of actions, and we invite organizations to respond to this consultation by the 15th of July. You can read more about it in the link that has been provided in the chat. And the outcome of this co-creation process will be a set of 6 stakeholder group actions for the 6 stakeholder groups you can see on the slide, which we will present at our annual symposium in November, and which we will aim to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. So please do visit the Real World Evidence for Decisions website and follow our LinkedIn page to stay up to date with our activities. Thank you all once again, and wishing you a lovely afternoon.